Hello,
Hello,
I am Alex,
I'm Val.
and we're here to talk about a pretty major episode,
Yeah,
the test stream.
a pretty hard one to talk about.
Wow, there's a lot going on. And we
Yeah,
have to be honest, this is the first time our in at the end format has changed because last night we watched this episode.
and we were going to record this
We were
podcast
going to
right
record
after.
right after, but it was just too much.
Also, we were really tired.
Also, we were really tired. Our classic in at the end season 5 technique seems to be leaving things to the last minute because we have a lot of things going on right now. And then last night we watched this episode
And it was
and
like
we were gonna
midnight.
record. Yeah. And then it was just too much. It was it was just there's so much going on in this episode we felt like we couldn't do it justice. So we woke up, we kind of reviewed the episode, and now we're here for real. So, full disclosure,
It's the
in at
first
the
time.
end,
It's the first
format
time.
has changed for this episode, but it's basically the same. It's just separated by
It's just
sleeping.
it's just the morning time now.
Yeah, that's all, which is different. So, test stream. Definitely a pretty radical departure from the kind of feel and approach to having episodes in this show, expanding on the dream format in a similar way to Funhouse from the second season, something we haven't seen.
Yeah, but even
Been like
Funhouse
this.
was broken up by reality,
Yeah.
right? It was like many different dreams.
Yeah, so in this episode, it's essentially, I guess, a 20-minute or so sequence that's just happening all at once, and we're just kind of hopping around from scene to scene. And the thing that's interesting about this episode for me is that as we're in the aspects, the parts of this episode that are actually in reality, there is this kind of dream-like, surreal atmosphere that's portrayed. And I think that we get that just in a lot of different ways. I mean, even the very first scene that we have at Valentina's, one could imagine that perhaps it is a dream when she sets herself on fire.
Well, there's like she has like a weird apartment with these weird curtains behind her bed.
We have the William Wegler dog portrait on the wall, which has
Yeah.
been referenced before in Camelot.
Yep.
In Camelot. And the relationship that has for Tony and his subconscious to his dad giving away the dog to Fran.
Yeah.
But there's kind of like weird imagery.
But then we
happening in
also
that
have
space.
the smoke detector, right? Which like kind of reminds me of a dream. I don't know, and this maybe just is me, but like it's one of, like when your alarm clock kind of like gets into your head in your dream and you hear like you're hearing your alarm clock, but it's the sound of something else. It did kind of have this like waking. Like it sounded like it was like something to like wake you up. I don't know.
Right.
That's just me. That happens to me all the time where I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, that's a funny sound to
Yeah.
happen, but it's like actually just my alarm clock.
Well, in that way, I think that everything kind of feeds into itself in this episode. The aspects of reality are feeding into the dream through kind of getting into Tony's subconscious and then manifesting himself in his dreams in funny ways. And also in the same way, the dreams are kind of impacting reality in this kind of fantasy-like way, in the way everything's portrayed. Actually, a lot of the directing decisions, like a lot of the shots, kind of reflect surreality or some surrealism. There's a lot of wide angles. There's a lot of strange focuses on things that actually repeat themselves in the dream sometimes.
Yeah, that downward angle of people sitting, like being shot from kind of like their knee level and seeing them sitting, like Tony when he's at Tony B's house.
Yeah.
The hallway, like the hallways of the Park Plaza, it's almost like
Yeah.
it's almost like Tony's
As it
kind of
kind
like
of follows.
floating through this space in
Yeah.
some ways too. Yeah.
Definitely. There's a lot of examples. Melfi at the plaza showing up, that kind of seems like a
Right.
dream. It's like we don't even touch on that, but it makes us question, like, is this real? Because it's so strange that she would be there and we don't deal with it.
Yeah.
Is that popping up as a part of Tony's subconscious? In fact, that's the only
it
time we
might be.
actually see Melfi in this episode.
Yeah.
There's so many things. Even then, like when Tony goes into his room, the shot of the shower head, we see the water coming out of the shower head. Of course, that's reflected in Coach Molinaro's space as he's walking to the underground of the school. At the end, we have a similar shot on water dripping from a shower head. We have a lot of symbols that are showing up in reality and in the dream. We have when Tony Soprano is at Tony Blundetto's house, there's a row of animals on
behind
the ledge,
him. Yeah.
on the ledge behind him. There's just
the other one that like goes between reality and the dream is the phones and that beeping light on the phone.
Yeah.
Like when he's actually, you know, ostensibly in real life, he makes that call to Charmaine. He sees the ad for the escort agency, right? Then he goes outside and he goes to steal his neighbor's newspaper. And he comes back in, and there's been this call that's just happened that he's missed, and that's like a strange time. Like it's very strange that would have happened. The call from, who called him? Was it Polly who called him to tell him?
Syl.
It was Syl who called him to tell him. But like that he would have like just missed that call by a second, and then we see that phone when he, you know, in the dream when he wakes up and Carmine's there. It shows up a number of times in the dream as well.
Even in that scene when he's in the Park Plaza and eating, they have some kind of like fade edits that show that time is passing as he goes through eating his meal. Time is passing, but we're not witnessing everything. So that happens in multiple different ways in the episode where we don't witness aspects of time as it passes and things actually happen during that time, which is really interesting. There's also an aspect of, for me, realism in the dreams sometimes and fantasy dreamlike sequences in reality that make it confusing to know where you are. Things like when Phil Leotardo is shot and he's asking when he can get up. It's actually like hyper realism in a way because we're almost dealing with the shooting of this show, like the fictional nature of what's happening. That kind of is clearly a dream, but at the same point is not realistic in the way that he dies. Also, I mean, I guess Tony Blundetto does shoot him with his hand.
Right.
Afterwards for the killing blow. But there's just some strange things that are kind of playing into the two kind of realms that exist within this episode, and they kind of feed off of each other.
Well, there's like multiple realms, right? There's not just two. There's like the quote-unquote reality of Sopranos world, but that exists within the reality of our world, right? And then there's also this dream world within Sopranos. So there's there's multiple levels going on there.
Mm-hmm. On that note, this kind of aspect of fantasy was kind of playing in for a couple different ways for me, because in reality I feel that Tony is kind of living in a fantasy sometimes. He's engaging with things to distract himself from the problem at hand that he needs to deal with. Tony Blundetto. He's
he's fantasizing about being with Charmaine Bucco.
Which is clearly preposterous. I mean, if there's one person that we know in the show who can't stand Tony and would never be a match for him and would never stand for his bullshit, it's her. Yeah. And yet Tony's living in this fantasy where he thinks that he can have her.
He says even like, it almost worked out with us or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Right. No, totally. The Jade escorts, for me, the fact that it's interesting. Like, I was trying to take note of Tony in his dreams. There was a scene that when we went back and looked at it, it was interesting. But like after Phil Leotardo's killed, like when he sees kind of like a mob of people, they're overwhelmingly white for me. And I mean, there are people of color, but when Tony is going through reality, I was thinking about like how he interacts with people and what his world is. He deals with a pretty ethnically kind of homogenous group of people, this Italian-American immigrant kind of group. And throughout the episode, in the reality, when he did deal with people of color, it was fairly consistent in that they were kind of working in jobs that kind of like served him. Like there was Charisse, who was
the
concierge at the Park Plaza. There was Jesus, also at the Park Plaza. There was the Guatemalan who he's complaining about. And then he's drawn to the Jade escorts, which was interesting for me because as Tony engages in fantasy, I feel like he was drawn to something out of his normal realm. And the fact that he's drawn to Jade escorts with a race that he kind of never really deals with, and that he would be drawn to that. I don't know. There's something about him escaping his space, going to New York, going to the Park Plaza, kind of getting away from everything. I feel that he's kind of diverting his attention from what he needs to do, and he's kind of he's exploring kind of, I don't know, other areas or something.
Yeah. Well, Tony never goes that far. I mean, I guess we saw him go to Miami, right?
Right.
But like in the episode, like at the very beginning of the episode, Valentina is asking him to go to Antigua, to go to Sandals or Sneakers, as Tony calls it. And we know that that's something that he would never do. He's never like, and she's complaining. She's like, I don't see enough of you.
Yeah.
And you're getting, I see you less than ever, and you're getting a divorce.
Yeah.
And we know that he would never, like, he just would never do that. We don't see Tony, like, taking an airplane to Antigua. But he does do this escape, and he goes to a place that he knows, right? Like, we've seen him at the Park Plaza before. We know that Meadow and Carmela go to the Park Plaza for their Eloise tea.
Yeah.
It's, like, we're dealing with all these New York guys right now, right? Like, it's in kind of their realm. But that's kind of, that is like a far fantasy for Tony to be living that life, right? He's like escaping that his mom's house is driving him crazy and whatever, and so he like moves to the Park Plaza.
Yeah.
Which is also very like fantastical in some way. Like what you're gonna live at, like you're Eloise now, Tony.
Right.
Like you're like you live at the Park Plaza. You brought these pictures of Meadow and AJ.
Yeah.
And you now live at the Park Plaza under a fake name. It's very fantastical.
It is. And I feel like there's a lack of taking responsibility for what he's even doing. Like when he arrives there and the valet parking guy asks him short or long-term parking, he says, can't you just park it? Like he doesn't want to make that decision.
Yeah.
There's an aspect of it that just doesn't even make any sense.
Yeah.
I mean, financially it seems very irresponsible.
Yeah, I don't even know what that would cost a night.
A lot.
He's
Yeah.
paying in cash. But yeah, that actually is interesting, like that relationship to Eloise, because at the end of, this is really hard not to jump around all over the place. We'll try to be organized, but
That's kind of the nature of this episode.
But at the end of the episode, when he's with Coach Molinaro, he says, I'm not a kid anymore. Mm-hmm. And the coach is like, oh yeah? Or like, I forget like exactly. He's like,
or like, no,
you're not. Yeah. But he kind of says it in this sarcastic way. And I think like
there's multiple ways to interpret that statement.
Yeah, I know. But one of the ways I interpret it is like that Tony is stunted. Like he is being childish. He's running away from his problems.
Right.
And the problems that he's running away from stem really deep from his from his time in high school and from his time 17 years ago when he didn't show up, for this thing with Tony B.
Right.
He's kind of stuck in those time periods and hasn't dealt with those things. And I think that's like, we'll talk more about the coach element of the dream for sure. But I think like that's a big part of this for him is like, like being stuck.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
And Eloise had a pet turtle. So.
Did she know?
Yep,
right, yeah, we talked about this. What a strange existence.
Yeah, but that's like, that's like, it's the same hotel. It's the hotel where they go to have Eloise tea. Like, there is a relationship there.
Yeah. Nope, totally, yeah. So, I mean, I think throughout the episode, we just have so much connective tissue from the entire series. Like, we have symbols that we've been talking about for this entire podcast that are showing up all over the place, are clearly nestled in Tony's subconscious, and are informing kind of the direction of the dream. It's a harder one to do a podcast about an analysis, and I think that's kind of what we were feeling last night, because there's so much that's fed to us, and the ironic thing is, as they make the most of the symbols that they've been developing for an entire show, I don't know if you can dissect everything. I think part of it is just a manifestation of Tony's subconscious.
Well, I think it's also David Chase playing with us, because there is such a, like, at least for us, but for a lot of people, there's this drive to be like, this symbol means this and this symbol means that. And he's always played with that with us. And then, but like also playing with the fact like there are some things that you just can't analyze that way. That there's some things that are beyond.
And it is kind of dream
beyond
logic.
explanation.
Like, it's beyond that. Yeah. It has some very David Lynch-like moments.
Yeah, the like movies within
the very Lost Highway.
Yeah. So maybe do you want to talk about the real life stuff briefly first, and then we can kind of dive into the dream stuff. I mean, we touched on some of it already, but like just kind of like the main plot point in this for this episode, right? Which like in Funhouse, and like in Calling All Cars, we have things revealed to Tony through dreams,
Yes.
right? So it is, I mean, it's kind of amazing, really, that he is in some ways very in touch with his subconscious, that he like trusts his subconscious so much to like tell him these messages, right? So in some ways it's really cool. But the main plot point of this episode is that Angelo was killed by the Leotardo brothers.
Mm-hmm.
We also have big questions about how those two guys are brothers.
Right.
That's
the big mystery.
That is like, I think that is
the age difference?
Unsolvable. I feel like it's at least like 40 years. So I really don't know how those guys are brothers.
35. I mean, that's not a thing that can happen. I mean,
I know this is the most unexplainable thing about this episode.
It's the great mystery of The Sopranos.
Yeah. Anyways, the Leotardo brothers kill Angelo, who, you know, was the consigliere for Carmine at one point, was in jail with Tony Blundetto, is now also out with all these other people, and is, you know, with Rusty and little Carmine in his group of the New York mob. And we have that happen after he comes to see Tony Blundetto at his new casino thing.
Yeah. We find out the closeness of those two, Tony Blundetto saying he was his old man, his rabbi, and his priest all in one.
Yeah, and we even have Paulie later saying something along those lines too, like about how close, you know, how close they were in the can.
Yeah.
And so this death, like, we know that this death would really impact Tony Blundetto. We know that this is also in retaliation for the killing of Joey Peeps, right? Mm-hmm. So it's in some ways directly related to Tony Blundetto in this other way.
Right.
That like this is something that would really impact him, but is also retaliatory against the group that kind of planned that hit.
Yeah.
And so then we have this really, you know, this really strange scene where Tony goes over to Tony Blundetto's house with the enchiladas and he's acting really shifty. And Tony's very self-centered in a lot of it. Like, he's talking about this issue with Valentina and he's like, why do things always happen to me? And
it's funny though, like the first time we were watching it, I felt that like Tony was maybe overanalyzing it. I mean, he was just kind of preoccupied with the toys and stuff.
Yeah.
Like, it's hard. I mean, there's ambiguity there. It was interesting though on the second viewing of that scene. It's interesting because when Tony gets there, the way Steve Buscemi acts it, he looks very kind of perplexed and concerned as soon as he sees Tony in a way that reflects that he has deeper feelings than just being surprised to see him.
Right.
Because the way he acts it is he's very concerned, and then that kind of turns into surprise that he's even there.
Yeah.
But there's like an immediate reaction because he doesn't want him there.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Which is weird for us because we know their history and their closeness and whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I thought that too. I was like, maybe he's just being kind of cagey. Like, we don't know that he knows that Angela's been hit.
Right.
Or if he knows that Angela's been
We don't know. I mean, that's never stated.
Yeah.
I mean, we can definitely surmise that. But
it, you know, like on the like re-skimming of it, I think he probably did. I don't know.
I'm sure he did.
Who would have told him? But like the fact that, you know, he says to his twins, like, I'm going to bring you back to your mom's place early. And we find out later that he's been gone since then.
Yeah.
Right? So he, like, Tony left. He left with the boys and went to kind of carry this thing out. But if you've never watched this episode before, I think it's even more interesting in some ways too, because then you have that scene where he's just like driving and not picking up Tony's phone call, right? And so you're like, where is he going? What's he doing? Like, you know, your immediate instinct, I think, I don't know if you assume that he knew or not.
Well, we don't know that much about Tony Blundetto, and that's the thing that it's hard to kind of focus on sometimes, because as you watch this show and then take time away from it, sometimes I feel for myself that I have a more fully formed impression of characters than I actually do.
Yeah.
The show doesn't always feed us that much. So Tony Blundetto, they're just so masterful in creating an arc for characters without that much information that sometimes you can kind of fill in the blanks more than you actually have. But he's not really a fully fleshed out character. Like, we don't know that much about him. We saw this transformation that brought him back into the family. But it's interesting, when Tony does get that call from Syl, he gets the call, he puts it down, he calls Tony Blundetto.
Yes.
So Tony obviously knows enough about Tony Blundetto's character that he knows that this could be an issue and he might be doing something stupid.
Yeah.
I guess could also just be in danger, but I think he's worried about the impact of what he would do. He's also worried about how it would impact him.
Yes.
So,
well, he says we're all fucked or something.
Well, at the end, I mean, they are all fucked, it seems, because of what Tony Blundetto does.
Then does, yeah.
But it is interesting because this episode, in a very surreal way, does kind of offer more perspective into who Tony Blundetto is.
Mm-hmm. But I get, yeah. So I guess, like, then, but, you know, like, Tony's obviously, like, at, you know, in those moments, I don't think, prior to his dream sequence, I don't think that he's thinking, I need to kill Tony Blundetto. I don't think that's his, like, when he's calling Polly and when he's calling the house, like, I think he is a little bit, like, more concerned. And I think, like, wanting to stop anything stupid from happening. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it's, like, the only way I'm going to stop this guy is to kill him. Mm-hmm. But the major then the quote-unquote plot development in the dream is that he realizes that this is what he's going to need to do.
And yet, in the dream, the climax of the dream is him being told by everybody that he needs to carry out this job to kill his friend. And yet, in the end, he goes with the silencer to Coach Molinaro. Mm-hmm. So, at least within the sequences of the dream, it seems that things are leading him to kill somebody other than Tony Blundetto.
Right.
We can kind of put it together in the end what it actually means.
Right.
But it's interesting where it leads Tony in the moment. At this point, it just kind of seems like it's bringing up other questions and other issues that Tony has in a very deep level of his subconscious, that kind of underground, that foundation.
Well, and dreams
of
are
who
like,
he is.
and dreams are like that, right?
Yeah.
Because it does tie into, like, his choices as a boss and his, like, his being a leader, right, does stem back to these moments when he was in high school where, you know, he was told that he was something special and this leader. But is he, like, you know, he even now refers to himself as kind of like a coach, right? But these decisions that, like, is he capable of being a good leader, and what does that mean for Tony? Or is he just using people and kind of, like, keeping people wrapped around his fingers? I don't know.
Maybe both.
Yeah.
Maybe that is his style of leadership. I mean, part of this, of Tony having to come to an understanding and an answer and a solution, is that he needs to make a leadership call. Mm-hmm. Like, as a leader, he needs to make a call on how he's going to respond to what's going to happen or what has happened, depending on how you view the timeline, to Phil Leotardo.
Yep.
And so
then we
needs to make a decision.
Yeah. Yeah. So then back in real time after the dream, right, where he, like, this is kind of indicated to us, at least as viewers in the dream, and to Tony, I think, in his subconscious, we have him waking up. We're not sure if he's really woken up, right, because he's woken up in this dream before. He goes, he looks in the mirror. There's a weird 5:15 a.m. phone call that comes from someone whose name we don't know. Of course, it's Christopher using a fake name also.
That's actually kind of the same time that's on in the background of when he's with Carmela about to go to the dinner with Finn, isn't it? Isn't that like 5:10ish? 5:15?
In the evening, yeah. And then we find out that Tony Blundetto killed Billy Leotardo, which is so, I think that's, like, one of the, like, again, like, showing how much Tony really is impacted by his dreams. Mm-hmm. He's like, wait, you mean Phil?
Right.
Right? Because that was something that happened
yeah.
in his dream,
yeah.
right? And maybe, like, I could think about it in a way, like, maybe that would be, like, Billy, like, Phil is higher up than Billy.
Yeah.
Right? And so, like, who was really, like, instigating the hit on Angelo? I don't know. I would think probably Phil was more in charge of that than Billy, but I don't know how these guys are brothers even, so that's all a mystery to me. You know, or I guess, like, maybe he intended to kill them both. Mm-hmm. I mean, we know that Phil got winged, which I guess means, like, hit with some bullets but not killed. Right. I don't know.
I've never been winged.
Yeah. And yeah, so we find out that that's something that's really happened within this time that Tony's been asleep.
Mm-hmm.
We don't see it this episode.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have Tony saying we're all fucked. And then we have this, his response then, kind of like after Christopher leaves, is he turns off all the lights again.
Yeah.
Right? He doesn't jump into action at all.
Right.
Right? Like, the lights were all on when Christopher was there. He turns off the lights. He looks out the window at, this over Central Park.
The darkness.
And the dark, and he calls Carmela and refers to, like, the lights are being all turned on. Is it light where you are?
Yeah, there's a lot of focus on light there.
He's kind of waited, like, what's going to happen kind of like when dawn comes for Tony right now. But he does have this kind of, like, period, and, like, it is kind of like between dream and waking, right? Like those kind of, like between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. kind of hours, even like in literature and stuff like that, are considered to be this like in-between state, like being in between dream and sleep, but also like being in between realms, kind of,
right.
Like that this is like a spirit time kind of thing. And so he's kind of like left himself in this space, and he makes this call to Carmela, and they talk about the light, and they talk about this dream,
and we see in the end Carmela, like, a sliver of light does actually show up next to her. I mean, I think that Tony is engulfed kind of in the darkness. He kind of pulls that interesting, like, white drape too, to see the darkness, and then is kind of obsessed with the light, asking Carmela about it. But it's interesting because I think that the other major development in this episode is pushing Tony and Carmela closer together. I mean, even in Tony's subconscious, we have the scene where he's saying that he's interested in coming back. Carmela says that there are these non-negotiable terms, which is funny because that's what she said to AJ about coming back to live with her. So that's another example of something being nestled in Tony's subconscious. But
he wants to move in with his horse, though.
He wants to move in with Biomai, or whatever horse.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because, again, the subconscious realm does kind of propel the story forward in one of its most important ways.
Yeah.
That they're getting closer together to getting back together, which has been a major arc of this season.
Yeah. And we'll see where that, definitely. They have this, like, very intimate kind of half awake, half asleep conversation, which is, like, kind of where your truest self is, right? When you're kind of, like, between sleep and being awake. It's childlike. It's, I don't know, it's innocent in some ways.
But I think also the kind of two poles of white and black that we've talked about a lot on this episode, the simplicity of, like, good and evil, that kind of make up the way Tony thinks about a lot of things. Like, he can see things in those two kind of dualistic terms. And I think that he's looking for, like, what he sees as a return to the kind of, like, lightness of life with Carmela and going back to home. He's obviously a little bit disheveled and in a place that isn't really holding together right now.
Yeah. Well, I like that he says, is it light where you are? Because, like, New Jersey and New York aren't in, like, different time zones or anything like that.
It's pretty close.
Yeah, like, it's...
We could get an Uber there right now.
Yeah. So I think it is kind of like you said, like, he sees that as this kind of light, as this, like, where Carmela is might be lighter than where he is, because where he is still really dark.
Right.
And lights are coming on. He can see lights, but he's in this dark space. The other thing that shows us, again, like I said, like, the seriousness of Tony's dreams for him is that he's really concerned about Artie.
Yeah.
When he wakes up, and he asks, like, that's the one, like, one of the things he's like, cancel the fishing trip. I had one of my Coach Molinaro dreams, and they talk about that. They talk about how he took interest in him, but then he says, is Artie all right?
Yeah.
He was in a car full of dead guys.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about the dream.
Well, Artie's role in the dreams is fascinating too, because he's kind of a guide. He's constantly telling Tony where to go. When he's at Vesuvio's, he's pointing through the hole in the door.
When he's being chased by the mob.
When he's being chased by the mob, he tells him to turn down the alley. Which is interesting, actually, because I guess he's running towards a car. And then Artie kind of directs him in another direction. But it's interesting because Molinaro also references Artie, saying that he was the worst of all of them. So there's clearly something in Tony's subconscious that exists about his relationship to Artie and who Artie is, coming from those formative high school years.
Yeah.
And that he's kept him in his life, but Artie has also guided him. Like, maybe in some ways there's an aspect of blame or something that he's now able to cast on Artie for guiding him where he is. Coach Molinaro talking about him as the worst in a similar way to this cheap, easy way out of blaming things on his mother or his father, as Coach Molinaro says. I think that Tony is constantly looking for reasons why he is the way he is and not taking responsibility. But it's interesting that he's kind of just floating around in this dream, and Artie's the one who tells him where to go.
Yeah.
There's something to
I
that.
know. And that Artie is like in the cars with him, driving him. Like, he is the only alive guy that we see in most of that dream. Like, I guess like Phil Leotardo is there, who's also alive. But that's about and he's being shot. Like, we don't have a lot of people from the real world actually in this dream. We have mostly people from who are dead.
Carmela, I guess. Yeah.
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 No, totally.
Yeah. So do you want to like talk about some of the dream stuff?
Let's do it.
Do you want to go like through it let's go through it in like a straight up order?
Straight up order.
It's really hard. It's so difficult. Okay. So our first little dream scene is him, like, we hear this, what we imagine to be this Jade escort service woman who was there before Tony was in bed, asking him if he wants a blowjob. And then but we're kind of confused, right? Like, it's kind of daylight out at this point, right? It like Tony's waking up, and it turns out that in bed beside him is Carmine, who's dead.
Right. Who also focuses on how much he misses Violet.
Right. I like that Tony's like violin, yeah.
But his wife. So, I mean, there's something there, too, about Tony missing Carmela.
Yeah.
Or at least getting that advice from somebody else, maybe even from Carmine. Like, other people are pushing him in this direction for how we should feel.
Yeah. We also have this link, like, really strongly to some kind of, what happens after we die kind of stuff. We have Carmine saying, like, it's lonely on the other side. If it's him, tell him you ain't seen me, right? And he points, he's like the man upstairs or whatever he says, right? So, like, clearly this is something, and I've definitely like found this in this viewing, like these, like the way that characters deal with the afterlife is really something that stood out to me on this viewing. And so we can see, like, Tony definitely has this as part of his subconscious quite heavily, right? This like concept of afterlife and where people are. Yeah.
It's interesting too how Carmine plays into his dream, because we see earlier in the episode Tony saying to Tony Blundetto,
he
Carmine smelled burning hair.
Yeah.
And then he shows up. So again, there's so many links from what Tony experiences in reality that we get to see to what unfolds in his subconscious.
And then I really like, it's so dreamlike that they look over at the phone before the phone starts to ring, right? Like, Carmine kind of peers at the phone, and Tony looks at the phone, and then it rings. And then there's someone on the phone. I don't know who's on the phone.
I don't know who's on the phone either.
It doesn't sound like, I was thinking, like, could it be God. Artie? It's maybe it is. Well, yeah, Tony's like, no. Like, I love how he, like, shakes his head. He's like, no, it's not him. Yeah. Like, but I don't know who it is. When we watched it back this morning, I was listening, like, is that Artie's voice? It's not. I couldn't figure that one out.
Yeah, not sure. Please email us if you know, we're interested.
Yeah, but, someone's on the phone. They say, like, our friend, he's got to go. And that's about all the information we get from that phone call.
Yeah, and I guess in some ways that kind of propels the whole dream sequence. I mean, that friend who has to go is the thing that kind of keeps on playing back. That's kind of the connective tissue of the dreams.
Yeah, the other connective tissue of the dream is being prepared, and Tony saying that he's done his homework. Yeah. Which gives us kind of hints as we go towards the end of the dream, where it is about kind of like being in high school and, and this being prepared
Yeah.
kind of like what we think about like the dream. It's like a very common, in psychoanalysis, like it's a very common dream to have this dream that you have a test that you haven't studied for, right? It's a stress dream.
But it's interesting what Tony's test is now.
Yes.
Like what his, a lot of the time.
It's not a school test. Yeah.
That's not the kind of test that I get stressed out about in my dreams, murdering somebody.
Yeah. Yeah, murdering your cousin who you're very close with. And so then we have this dream, and we're used to him having dreams like this that are, like that length, right? So this dream seems to end, and we see him sitting in Melfi's office, right? And there's nothing right away that indicates to us that he's not in Melfi's office, right? He's actually talking about this dream that he had where Carmen was there. But we don't see Melfi, and we usually it goes on a little longer than usual that we don't see Melfi. Usually we have the camera kind of going back and forth between Tony and Melfi, or showing us both of them, and really we just see Tony and we see like a slight outline of what we think might be Melfi, but it's not. It's Gloria, who's dead. But
her voice is interchanged with
Melfi's. I know, in such a cool way. I really like it. It's particularly when she's
talking about the fork in the eye, right?
Yeah, that's your mother, right? Yeah. And he spits water all over the place.
They have such good jokes amongst each other. So funny.
Yeah, there's that whole
abuse
50s sitcom
the honeymooners.
But it's really, that scene is really intense, right? Because she's like, yeah, I remember when you punched me, or and then you choked me, it's really, and then especially her line where he's where they're using this very Melfi line that's been said a number of times before, where it's therapy is, I like to think of it as being like childbirth, and Tony's like, I think about it like taking a shit.
This is the first time though where he actually says maybe it is like
childbirth, and he's like, you tell me.
Yeah.
And then she has that line where she's like, I don't have any children, I died too young. It's really quite, gives me a little bit of goosebumps. And we have that scene ending, and so we have Melfi's voice being overlaid, but she ends that segment with saying, are you ready for what you have to do? And Tony saying, I've done my homework. He's like, I am ready, I've done my homework. And so she's also kind of pointing Tony, reminding him of what it is he needs to do. So there's and she appears again later in the dream, right, as this kind of reporter character. So she's obviously someone who is quite important in Tony's subconscious, right?
Yeah.
And so in some way, I don't know, for good or for bad or for what reason, but that she is also kind of propelling Tony down this path to figure out who he is and what he needs to do. And
yeah, she's acting as a therapist substitute. Yeah, somebody who would be guiding him and answering his questions.
And I think we talked about this when we found out in the series that Gloria died, right? We find out, we don't see her death. We find out when Tony finds out, but we do see him grappling with that at that time as well, right? So we know that she was really important to him, and kind of pivotal in him going kind of on this, I think, kind of downwards trajectory.
Yeah, no, totally. Where do we go there next?
After that, we're in the car.
Okay.
So we've seen the car.
Right, from the TV.
Yes, so on TV in Melfi's office, there's all these small TVs around, which I don't think they're usually there, these very small TVs. But
I don't think people use small TVs anymore.
I know. My family never had a small TV like that.
No.
Yeah. Sorry, our cat is trying to come into the room.
It happens.
So we see on... Go away. We see on the TV that there's this scene in the car, right? We see the back of Johnny Soprano's head, and we see his eyes in the rearview mirror, and then we're transported into the car through that television screen. And we've seen this car before, right? We've seen it in Calling All Cars.
I think so.
And we've seen it.
Have we seen it multiple times?
I do think. I think there is one in Funhouse.
Wow. Okay. I think you might be right. Yeah.
And I talked about it when we saw it last time, which I think was in Calling All Cars.
Yeah.
But
okay.
I'm pretty sure it was also in Funhouse. And this is a familiar thing we've seen. So we see Johnny Soprano, who's clearly dead, right?
Yeah.
We see this kind of childlike aspect, right? Like we see like how it must have been for Tony as a kid, right? He's like, do you want to ride up front, champ, or something? I don't think he calls him champ, but
Tony is being driven around though. He's being chauffeured by these people.
But I like how
by
he's
dead
asked,
people.
like, and he kind of like smiles, and he like kind of enjoys seeing his dad there in this car that he would have, you know, ridden in as a child. He also asks if it's okay to smoke, right? Which we know from the In Camelot episode that, you know, he had emphysema and Tony was really mad at Fran for like allowing him to still smoke in the car.
Yeah.
But then we get other passengers that come into the car. So we have Pussy in the front seat as well.
Yeah.
We have Mikey Palmise sitting beside him in the car, who then it's Artie a few seconds later. Artie is in the seat of Mikey Palmise. And then we have Ralphie in the front seat. And Tony's like, where are we going? You know? And Ralphie says to the job, which is also from that last car dream sequence where they're taking him to that old house.
Yeah.
And the job, it seems like at least they pull up into the driveway of the Soprano home.
So it's interesting because I feel like that's an example of Tony distracting himself from what he needs to do. And that happens a lot in this episode. So, I mean, there's really countless examples. He gets the original call saying that Angelo Garepe's dead. He switches his attention to the Jade escort. In Melfi's office, he kind of goes to kiss Gloria, which would change the direction of the dream. And then Gloria actually stops him. She kind of silences him and then points and then directs him to the car.
Right.
He's in the car. They're bringing him to the job. He goes inside his house and then he's going to meet Finn.
Although the car does pull up to the house.
The car... Well, yeah, the car does pull up to the house. I guess. And I guess he's being driven. But, I mean, he's also, in some ways, his subconscious is directing the flow of
I know
things.
what you mean.
I think that... He's not taking responsibility, which is a theme that we've seen throughout the entire show. He's not doing what he has to do. He's constantly distracting himself with things that are unrelated. You know.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting. I'm glad we see the car coming back because I think that is a big symbol like this. Like, what is driving Tony? Or who is responsible for the direction that Tony's life has taken?
Question.
And we ask those questions a lot. Like being in therapy, he's asking that, like, who's responsible for the direction? He doesn't like to put blame on himself, right? So it is always
well, and it's interesting because we are witnessing all these other people directing Tony, but we also know that this is coming from his subconscious, from his dreams, and that is him. So it's kind of a story that he is creating and piecing together. So at the end of the day, it's maybe up to us to figure out the answer to who is responsible for Tony being the way he is.
Yeah.
But we have to acknowledge that he's kind of the narrator of the story that we are witnessing.
Yes.
And at the end of the day, it's kind of him who's putting it all together.
Right. And we know that he doesn't like to take any blame, right? And so it's even happening, like he can create that for himself in his dreams as well.
Yeah.
So then we have Tony in the house with Carmela. They're going to go meet Finn's parents.
Yep.
But Tony's not dressed. Tony's unprepared, right? He's actually not ready for this thing that they're about to do.
Yeah.
He says to Carmela, he's like, I had the weirdest dream. And we kind of see him trying to figure out in some ways, like in his dream, whether or not he's still in his dream.
Yeah.
Right? He's like, I'm just give me a second. And he's like trying to figure that out. We have a lot of then movies on TV. We have, and I'm not good at that kind of quoting of movies, but I do know that one of them is the Christmas Carol. We'll talk about that in a sec. Yeah. But one of them is this cowboy movie, and
there's all these westerns that have been referenced throughout the show. Again, there's connective tissue just from Gary Cooper and him watching these different movies throughout the entire series. And
he says it's so much more interesting than life.
And then Carmela says, what are you kidding me? It is your life.
Yeah.
So for me, that's fascinating because Tony's seeing all these strong, silent types, these kind of cowboy characters, finding it so much more interesting. And Carmela's kind of calling him out that actually is who he is. So, he's saying, what about the Gary Cooper as well? That is kind of who he is.
Yeah.
Things haven't really changed from that first episode where that is his idealized version of what a person should be. And he is drawn to all these distractions and what ifs, but at the end of the day, I think his life is exactly what he's looking for. And I mean, the irony is that we're watching it as entertainment. Right.
Yeah, of course.
So,
yeah.
He's
So
unhappy,
meta.
but
Yeah.
we are watching it. He's watching other things.
Yeah.
Looking for entertainment, but his life is obviously a source of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we
yeah.
see the Christmas Carol, right? Which I think, so we see this, it's this scene in which Scrooge wakes up. He's just had this dream where the three ghosts come to visit him.
And he changes.
And he's someone who then his life takes a completely different track.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't see like Christmas Carol Part 2, like what really happens going.
Christmas Carol Part 2,
Yeah.
Ebenezer's
Yeah,
Demise.
yeah. I mean, who knows? Like, but that is a book, and the movie that assumes that people can change based on these kind of psychic experiences that they have, or these psychological, subconscious experiences. Mm-hmm. People are changeable. I don't know. In this show, we definitely have a different tack. I'm not sure.
Definitely.
I'm not sure if we think that, Tony's going to wake up for this dream and be a totally changed dude.
Tony Soprano is a guy with everything going for him until one day he has a dream and becomes a nice guy.
That would be a really boring show. That would not be much better than real life, which Sopranos kind of is. And then so we see the Christmas Carol. Then they see themselves on TV, and we see Carmela and Tony, and we see them kind of in like a slightly different relationship. We see Tony like helping her put on her jacket, and she's adjusting his suit. Like, it's obviously more intimate than they have been.
Yeah.
And it's more intimate than they are in the scene that they're currently in, right?
Yeah.
Like, he says, like, my stuff isn't here. Like, so we know that in that dream, like, they are still not living together.
Right.
But in this TV version of it, they do seem to be.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is, again, one of these hints towards, like, them getting back together.
Yeah.
I think.
We also have them wearing all black.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's...
Well, Tony's suit is brown, apparently.
Oh.
She says your brown suit is still here.
Oh, interesting. But it is black, isn't it? He seems... Anyway, I thought
So
I took
probably
it was
a
black.
dark brown suit.
Yeah.
And they're getting ready, and as they're about to head out the door, Tony loses a tooth.
Yeah.
And we've had a lot of references to mouths and
Dentistry.
teeth and dentistry.
Cancers of the gums.
Yeah, dental
Going back
students.
to Isabella in the
Yeah.
first season is a really important episode for kind of establishing
Again, his
those symbols.
subconscious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And this is obviously something that he thinks a lot about. I mean, this is just me, but like, I've heard that when you lose all your teeth in a dream, that it's actually a fear of growing old or growing up.
Oh, interesting.
And so, like, actually, kids often have like early, like preteens apparently often have that dream of like waking up and all your teeth are gone, and it is this like fear of growing up. And that was kind of, again, like I referenced that child, like Tony being kind of childish and being like Eloise at the Park Plaza. There's something about that, like, adults don't lose their teeth.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you lose your teeth when you're becoming an adult.
Right.
Kind of.
Interesting.
I don't know.
Very interesting.
But there's lots with dentistry and teeth, right? And so, like, there's this absence of like rotting. There's this aspect of
well, there
like,
was
like spewing lies, like just this kind of like cancerous, like the things that come out of his mouth are dishonest and hateful.
He was also drawn to Isabella as a student of dentistry, somebody who was in this kind of health-related caring profession. And we have Finn, who's also drawn to dentistry, who's essentially going to be going into dental school, which is something that Tony and Carmela seem to be very impressed by and like. And I think that it's very far away from the realm that they exist in, and there's something about like Tony with the symbolism of his teeth. There's something that is rotting and decaying and is not good, that he feels is kind of like falling apart. And yeah, it is interesting because also when they go to the dinner, Finn, I think, represents somebody, and we've talked about this, as somebody who's so far removed from the world that they live in. Even like the color scheme of his parents, like they're wearing, Annette Bening is like pure white.
His parents are Vin Makazian and Annette Bening.
Wow, what a pair.
Yeah.
But Vin Makazian even puts on this like white napkin. There's definitely like a visual contrast between them and Tony and Carmela. So they kind of represent these two poles almost that exist. And it's just interesting because I think that the dentistry is relevant. It represents something that Tony maybe feels like he needs, but is far away from the world that he lives in.
Yeah, and he loses another tooth during the dinner, which is really gross. Can you imagine? Like, it's very visceral. Like, I just like whenever that I see that happen, I like imagine that like that feeling. Can you imagine like a tooth just falling out in your mouth? It's very disturbing.
Yeah.
And like the root and the root. I don't know. There's something very like physical about it for me.
Yeah.
So we have the return of one of my favorite characters, maybe my favorite character, Vin Makazian.
He's great.
As Finn's dad. But we know that Tony also knows that that's Vin Makazian. He doesn't say it kind of like he does with Annette Bening, right? He like says to Annette Bening, like, you're Annette Bening.
Yeah.
And he seems like really content that he's like figured this out. Like he's like really happy. He's like, it's Annette Bening. Like he's kind of sitting there like kind of smiling to himself. But we don't see him do that with Vin Makazian until they go to the bathroom together and they're peeing. And he says to Vin Makazian, you don't do this no more, right?
Right. So what is it that he doesn't do? Live?
Pee.
Oh, right.
Well, like, you know what I mean? Like, do anything in the real world, right? But we know that he does kind of, in some way, know that that's Vin Makazian. But then he goes back to saying, like, that's a great boy you've got out there, right?
Yeah.
Like, so he kind of, like...
And another example of somebody kind of taking him out of the scene that he's in and saying, you have to do this thing. Are you going to do this thing?
Yeah.
Everywhere, all over the place. It keeps on happening.
Yeah. There's a reference again to homework there, right?
Yeah.
Of course, we have him doing this very Godfather kind of thing
trying to get the gun
checking
from
behind the toilet.
Yeah, looking at the Valachi papers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where I'm just looking at my notes right now.
There's a lot to talk about in this episode.
Oh my God. Oh yeah, Vin says to him, "Are you going to be able to come through on this?"
Yeah.
Right, and so again, kind of redirecting him. And Tony's looking for some like to escape. He sees Artie pointing towards there. He's looking to get out of this dinner.
Yeah.
Also, I like the other part. Sorry, just to go back for a second. I like when Carmela. The acting in this episode is also so great. It must have been actually really fun, I think, to film, because Carmela's like, "Show them what's in your pocket, Tony."
Yeah.
And then he takes out the tooth. Like, it's so creepy. And they talk.
She looks so crazy too when she has like her hand.
When she's watching Vin Makazian singing. Yeah, I know.
Oh my God.
And like Meadow too. Like Meadow's like laughing, like smiling and laughing. It's so weird. And we get a whole rendition of 3 Times a Lady.
Yeah.
By Vin Makazian. It's beautiful. But I also, so Tony in that scene, we'll go forward again. Tony, before they go to the bathroom, says to Annette Bening, something bad is going to happen.
Yeah.
Right? So we know that he's aware of this trajectory he's on in some ways too. But yeah, they're in the bathroom. You don't do this no more. And then we kind of transition, like, I think actually with gunfire, like I think we hear gunfire coming from outside when they're still in the bathroom, or coming from somewhere, and we're transitioned immediately to the street where Tony's then walking through this crowd and hearing gunfire, and then seeing Tony Blundetto shooting the gun. Like we have this like mob surrounding them. We have this wind in the trees that's really rustling the trees, and we've had that before.
So many times we've had that. I think all the way back to college.
Yeah.
It's the first example I can think of, but it happens all over the place. The wind in trees is definitely a pretty major symbol of the show.
We have these black men who are standing there saying, like, wasn't that the guy you were supposed to kill to stop all this from happening?
Right.
And this is kind of where the dream does take a turn, because I think like everything is indicating to us that like this is what he quote unquote needs to do. But he's like, I guess not. I don't have a piece. Yeah. Right. It wasn't behind the toilet, so it must not be that this is the thing that I had to do, or else all of those things would have somehow worked out. Like he would have found this piece behind the toilet. And gone to kill him. So I think that part's really interesting. Like he, in his dream, is like, I guess that's not, like I thought that's what I needed to do, but I guess it's not.
Yeah.
And I think that's what really kind of, at least for me, it's kind of like it shows him that he actually has to go deeper. He actually has to go further back to figure out what it is that he needs to do.
Yeah.
And that's when he starts to like be chased by this mob of people wearing lederhosen.
Right.
And
like, what is the problem that's confronting Tony Soprano? Like, if that's what he's trying to uncover in this dream, well, it's interesting because there's a deeper problem than the immediate one with Tony Blundetto.
And Tony Blundetto says, like, why don't you tell them about 17 years ago?
Yeah.
Right? And I think he even has to go further back than that, right? To kind of understand.
Interesting. Very interesting.
So yeah, then the guys in lederhosen are chasing him.
That was the other thing too, and I was going back to the very beginning when I was talking about like Tony's relationship to people of different race. That was the moment where, I mean, it felt like overwhelmingly Caucasian people who were kind of witnessing, but then in the periphery, in the alleyways behind him, and kind of off to the sides where people were kind of scattered, there were more people of color, and I think that that's kind of Tony's relationship to people of different races. Like, they are in the periphery, and that when his subconscious creates a scene of people witnessing and judging him, it is people all of this homogenous race. And then when he goes running off, he's kind of running off into this unknown area or something, or like into danger, because he has these weird preconceptions about.
There's this car playing rap music.
Yeah.
Rap music.
The rap music.
It's playing some rapping music.
But for Tony, I think that is how distant it is. It is like the rap music for him. Like, he doesn't know anything about this, and he's prejudiced against different groups because he doesn't interact with them. They exist in the periphery, and he doesn't really confront them.
He gets pulled down an alleyway with Artie.
Yeah.
So Artie, like, he's gonna go to this rap music car. But instead Artie kind of changes where he's going, and they're in another car. They're not in the same old car, Johnny Soprano's car. But they're in there with Richie Aprile and Gigi Sistone, who are also dead.
Yeah.
And Artie brings him, I guess, to have sex with Charmaine.
Another great example of a distraction.
Yeah. And Artie seems kind of into it.
He seems like a coach.
He does seem
He's
like
like telling him what to do and saying,
like, pet her muzzle.
And then we cut to Carmela and the
and we cut right to Pi and him rubbing Pi Oh My in the living room. There's actually a close up on the eye of Pi Oh My, like we've seen before.
Yeah.
And yeah, we had so we've kind of gone from that, I don't know, like, sequence of him feeling like, oh, I guess it's not about me killing Tony Blundetto, going with Artie and having sex with Charmaine, and then ending up at his home with Pi Oh My. And so it's kind of like, again, we're kind of, I think, like, getting deeper into it, right? Like, that we know Pi Oh My symbolized a lot to Tony. I mean, about a lot of things. I don't know if we have time to even unpack that again, but we've talked about it in previous episodes. But then again, we have him at home saying, like, I think I want to come home. Yeah. And we talked about that scene earlier. And then we have this last scene. So, like, after Tony, which I think also would have been a really hilarious scene for them to film, where Tony is on a horse in this living room set and has to, like, back out of it on this horse and turn around. I think he, like, almost bumps his head on the ceiling. We have him then transition to this school hallway, and this is the last scene of the dream, is him in this school.
And I think kind of the climax of the dream sequence and the episode, for me at least, I think it's a very, very significant moment for the show.
It's one that, like, well, you even were like, wait, this is in this episode? Like, this is in this dream?
I remember the last viewing, not this viewing, of Sopranos. This really stood out for me as one of the key moments of the entire series.
Yeah, I think it is. I really think it gives us a huge insight into Tony that we've not had before. We've had hints to it before, but this shows us a lot about what Tony understands about himself. Or what explanations he gives about himself. So I think, like, for example, like, kind of being criticized for blaming things on his mother or his father, and, like, that it's a shame that he's in therapy. He talks about, like, having the psychiatrist wrapped around his finger, and he says to the coach, like, you always told me that's what I'm good at. Right? Yeah. He says, like, I was just, like, when he was, I was just, or shutting you on? I don't know.
I thought it was shining you on. That's shining what I do to people.
That's what I do to people, right? So he understands, like he understands that about himself, that he's manipulative and that he does these things to kind of like get people to do things for him. But then we also have that line of "You'll never shut me up."
Well, that's where it's left. That's the end of the whole dream. And I think that Tony is going there to try and eliminate Coach Molinaro and this kind of like nagging voice that exists in his constant life.
Yeah.
And he can't. And Coach Molinaro is more powerful and says, "You'll never shut me up." There's a fascinating thing where Coach Molinaro with a cigar, we've talked about the cigar as a symbol of being in control, which is so fascinating for me because Tony appropriates that from his subconscious, often smokes a cigar when he feels in control. In that scene, Coach Molinaro is the one who's fully in control. Even shortly after, when it goes to reality and Tony's with Chris asks about can he have the Toblerone, we see an ashtray with cigarettes and a cigar, both put out. So there's this duality of Tony's both in control and out of control at that moment. So in some ways he is controlled, perhaps in getting back with Carmela, among some other things. He is able to kind of manipulate situations to get what he wants. But he's also clearly out of control as this situation kind of careens towards catastrophe with Tony Blundetto and New York. But it's just so fascinating that Coach Molinaro is such an important figure for him, and maybe the most important...
Well, we know this ties back into Tony almost being a varsity athlete, right? And
which is something we hear in the pilot episode.
Yeah.
Him in a voiceover saying how significant it was for when Junior made fun of him and how he was a varsity athlete and how it didn't, you know, how he didn't fulfill those dreams. And then that comes up at many times, at other times in the show. It's something that he cannot deal with because clearly this is one of the deepest things that he has to deal with.
Well, and even like we're in this like dungeon, right?
I think it's like a foundation for everything. It's like the foundation of his subconscious.
Yeah.
He has to go to, that's the deepest level. And that's where it ends. I don't think there is anything underneath that. And it's interesting, as he's walking down through the school, he sees the sports trophies and there's a reflection of himself with a gun. So he sees the sports trophies and yet who is he? He's this assassin, basically, or a gangster. He's not the person that he could have been, that could have evolved out of a...
Who was special, right?
A special, talented...
leader
of sports. And even when he says...
I am a leader.
I am a coach. Well, Coach Molinaro is also saying... I knew you would take the easy way out. And for him to be a coach, that's not what Coach Molinaro was talking about. That's a rationalization coming from Tony. For him to say, I'm a leader, I'm a coach, well, that's not what Coach Molinaro means at all. In fact, Tony has become the embodiment of everything that Coach Molinaro didn't want him to be.
There is something kind of like devilish about Coach Molinaro too. Like there is something about him being in there kind of smoke, like in this deep dungeon, this like lit room within this dark dungeon space where he is smoking this cigar and there's kind of this like haze of smoke around him. Also that actor, I don't know that actor's name.
Horseface from The Wire.
Horseface from The Wire.
It's amazing that his coach was also a union member in Baltimore.
But there is something kind of like, again, like we have references to God of some sort earlier in the episode, but we kind of end then with this
man downstairs.
Yeah. And
like,
so
we're referencing the man upstairs, and yet at the end, the person who seems to control Tony is the man downstairs.
Yep.
So interestingly, it seems like Tony's...
Thanks for taking my thunder there.
It's just such a good idea. I had to go with it. But it's fascinating. It is. It really is, because I think one of the questions that's also shown as early as the first episode is, where will Tony go? Carmela, as he goes into the MRI machine. You know, talking about him going to hell. Something that Tony references later. Well, where does he end up? Who is he controlled by? In fact, the dream sequence starts off with a reference to the man upstairs, and it's a constant descent downwards to the underground, to hell. That's Val's idea. I'm just explaining it for you.
Thanks. Thanks so much. Even though I don't think that's, I don't think Coach Molinaro was a bad guy. I don't think like he was.
Well, they even discussed that. Carmela and Tony. And Tony actually rationalizes immediately out of it. Saying, oh, he was just doing that to keep me out of trouble. It was easier to do it that way.
Carmela says, I wonder where he is now.
She also says, I don't know if that's true. Yeah. I wonder where he is now. Maybe he's in Baltimore.
On the ports.
With Frank Sabatka.
Yeah. So and then the dream ends.
Wow. Yes, it does. So it's interesting because then even when he's talking to Carmela, we're back in reality. He references one of his Coach Molinaro dreams.
Yes.
Which also brings importance to that moment because A, that's how he identifies the entire dream sequence. B, it's clearly happened a lot. And C, it's something that he's brought up with his wife, and they've discussed.
They know about it, yeah.
So it, again, just reinforces how important this is to Tony as a person.
Yeah, but also how deeply, like, Carmela does understand Tony pretty deeply, too.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think that's part of that drawback towards home, is that she is someone, like, they've been together since they were in high school, right?
Yeah.
Like, she's someone who's seen him go through this transition to being whoever he is now.
Yeah.
And so she has some understanding of that too.
Yeah.
Anything else that you have? This is long.
Whew. There's a lot in this episode.
I know.
No, I mean, just some straight. I mean, just some of the paintings, the pictures that we see earlier on. I mean, we have like the William Wegler in the first scene. We have a lot of boats on water and a kind of winter landscape portrait at Tony Blundetto's.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say about the fishing trip.
Yeah.
At the end, that
That
he
he has
like
to
that he's
cancel.
planned this fishing trip somehow, but that he's canceling a fishing
And again,
trip.
yeah, like
and like
he's
not going out onto water,
And
right?
also being drawn away, not going out onto water, being drawn away from being a good dad, somebody who would engage his son and do something with him. He's now, again, kind of engaging in this criminal underworld.
Yeah.
Instead.
Well, I think like water is kind of this symbol of like purity and the eternal, and
Not always, though.
not always.
Sure.
I know, but like just like avoiding water, I think is interesting.
Right. Interesting. Yeah.
What else do you have?
Oh, man. That's it.
That's it. I know.
Those pictures.
Yeah. Yeah. My notes are such a mess for this that
It's hard
I
not
don't
to.
think I can. Yeah. Well, that's what we think about Test Stream,
We think a lot about it.
and we'll probably continue to think about it.
Of course. Yeah.
And if you have any things that you want to tell us
We're
about
always interested.
Test Stream,
We
let
would
us
love
know.
to hear it.
And yeah, we have 2 more episodes of the season.
Yeah.
Long-term
Some
parking.
good ones. Yeah.
Is next.
Uneventful ones.
Yes, very uneventful episodes to end the season off. And then just as a heads up, I think we are going to be taking a little bit of a break.
Short
a
break
short
before
break.
we go into 6A.
We're actually moving, and so
Yes.
we just need to get that done before we can set up our recording system in our new house. Or apartment, rather.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But we'll be back soon
Yeah.
after that. But
Yes.
we'll finish off this season.
Yeah.
And can't wait.
See you then, is what
I
you were
was
going
going
to
to say that, and then I stopped.
Yeah, okay. See you then.